Screen here, and we should be
Yep, that's great.
on module 4,
We certainly
which
are.
is
Thank you.
today. So welcome everybody. What we're going to discuss today is tourist and services signs, information signs, a little bit about advertising signs, or that's not really about road signs, but is a bit of a bugbear of mine, so we'll cover a bit of that, pavement markings and guideposts and RRPMs. But first, let's have a look at the direction signs exercise that we set for you. And this was the exercise, and Viseth explained a bit about standard destinations, sometimes called standard through destinations. And the idea of standard destinations is you continue signing to those destinations until you get there. And it's the destinations with a black dot and a black arrowhead that are the standard destinations. But sometimes we add in a secondary one, and Bayview in the northbound direction here is a secondary standard destination, which means you should sign both of them at this intersection. So some of you just put in Bayview and some of you might have just put in Swansea, but you should put in both of them. And the order in which they appear on the sign should be the nearest one first. So Bayview should be on top of Swansea in the order that they appear on the advanced direction sign. So I've drawn up the solutions this way because I think it's good to sort of look at one direction of travel. In one direction of travel, you have the advanced direction sign, then the intersection direction sign, then the reassurance direction sign on the departure side. So this should be Bayview and Swansea straight ahead, and we should include both of them on that. Mansfield to the left, and then the ID sign has Mansfield to the left as well. ID signs have chevron ends, which I think all of you got correct. And Mansfield has the distance 65 kilometres because there's no reassurance sign in that direction. So after you've turned into the road towards Mansfield, there's no reassurance sign to tell you the distance. Therefore, you include the distance on the intersection direction sign. And then the reassurance sign on the departure side, Bayview, Swansea, 5 and 19 kilometres. I think you, all of you pretty much got that correct. Then in the other direction of travel, I've turned the map upside down just so the signs are the right way up. And the AD sign has got Q, and the route number is B12 and the C234 because those two routes overlap over this section of road. And Mansfield is to the right. And the RD sign, Mount Don 22, Q33, I think virtually everyone got that correct as well. Then from the side road, so coming from Mansfield, Bayview and Swansea to the left, and Mount Don to the right. And this is the tricky thing that Viseth was explaining, is that generally Q, because it's got the dot and the full arrow head here, that is the standard destination in that direction, and normally you would just sign to Q, but for some strange reason, I'm not quite sure why, in this particular case, it's been decided that we should sign to Mount Don in that direction rather than Q. And then after you get past Mount Don, then you sign to Q. And then the intersection direction sign, which would be on the far side of the road when you get to the T-junction, has Bayview Swansea to the left and Mount Don to the right. Again, Mount Don mirrors what was on the AD sign. Now, the way in which you set these out doesn't really matter. You could have Mount Don on top and Bayview Swansea on bottom, or you could have them back to back. But if you do have them back to back, make sure they are actually separate plates or separate panels. So there's a white line, at least one white line, if not two white lines, between the two panels. Otherwise, it would just look a bit messy. You're not quite sure what you're looking at. So they're the main things. Someone put separate panels, a panel for Bayview to the left and another panel for Swansea to the left, but that's unnecessary. If they're in the same direction, you combine them into the one panel. And some of you put distances on the intersection direction sign. So the sign, sorry, which one am I talking about? I'm talking about this one, aren't I? So when you're on the side road and you come up to the intersection, Mount Don is to the right. You don't need a distance there, and you don't need a distance on these signs because there's an RD sign further down the road, only a few hundred metres down the road, telling you the distance. So if there's an RD sign with distances in that direction, then you don't need the distances on the ID signs. Any other questions, Kathy?
David, could you just run through again why Mount Don and not also Q?
It's because of this blue arrow here that is unusual, admittedly, but VSEF has put this into the exercise just to demonstrate the point, that the normal standard destination would be Q, but because there's an override here, you sign to Mount Don. And the reason might be, I think in this case, Mount Don is how many kilometres away? 22 kilometres away. But it's more likely that you would have this situation if Mount Don was reasonably close, like within a kilometre or two. So if you're travelling from Mansfield and you look at a large scale map, you might think that this road leads you to Mount Don. And then you get to the end of the road and there's no sign to Mount Don, so you're not really sure whether Mount Don is to the left or to the right. So it's therefore a good idea to sign to Mount Don, because this road coming from Mansfield, you might well think when you're doing your navigation planning that this road is going to lead you straight to Mount Don because it's close to this T-junction. In this particular case, it's 22 kilometres away, in which case I'm not really sure that this argument holds. But that could be a reason why you would sign to Mount Don rather than Q if it was fairly close to this intersection. 22 kilometres isn't really that close. But that's the sort of reason why you might do that sort of override of the standard destination.
Okay, great, thank you.
I think that was about all. Oh, staggering the arrows. Sometimes some of you didn't stagger the arrows. That's a minor detail, but because this right arrow must be on the right-hand side of the sign, this arrow should be on the left-hand side of the sign. Of course, it could go either side, doesn't really matter as long as it's straight ahead. But staggering the arrows is a convention that we use because we think that that makes it just a little bit more readable and obvious to the driver as they're glancing at the sign. Okay, I think they're the main points. No other questions?
No, all good. Thank you for that summary, David.
Good. And this part of the solution is on the Schoology if you want to have a look at it in more detail. Okay, so let's get into today's topics. So firstly, tourist services, information and advertising signs. These are the tourist and services signs, and some of the information signs are covered in the Australian Standard Part 5 and Part 6. Information signs are a bit in Part 15, but a lot of the information signs are actually state specials and are therefore in the state supplements, which in Victoria's case is the Traffic Engineering Manual. And advertising signs aren't in any of the standards or guidelines, but we'll talk just a little bit about those as well. So firstly, street name signs. Some of you are from local government, and street name signs are the responsibility of local government. They should include the name of any connecting streets, and there should be street name signs basically at every intersection in the whole state. They're small rectangular signs with uppercase text, and the design should be basic to allow quick name recognition. And this is what the Australian Standard shows as the standard arrangement. There are a few variations that the Australian Standard allows, and putting in the house numbers is an option. Street or road or whatever could be large font, the same as the road name, or it could be smaller if you're trying to squeeze in the house numbers as well. There is a standard no through road sign, the G510, and that should be used for all no through road applications. But I noticed that there are a whole lot of different types of no through road signs out there, but really there's no reason why people shouldn't just stick to the standard version. But having said all of that, we recognise that virtually every local government area has got their own design of street name signs. If I had my way, I would unify all of this to a consistent design, but I think I've lost that battle many decades ago. So we recognise that street name signs are very different between different council areas. A lot of them are black and white, quite a few of them are white on green, but there's a whole lot of other things. I don't mind the idea of having a logo for the council on it, but it should be small and supplementary to the main information, which is what is the road name. I think the worst offender, I hope there's no one from the City of Melbourne here, if you see Lansdowne Street just down at the bottom of this montage of many different types, Lansdowne Street is one of the few that uses lowercase text, and they've used a font which is probably one of the most difficult to read. I mean, it's not as bad as, cursive fonts, but it's certainly not as legible as most of the other fonts. I think we said previously that generally speaking, lowercase fonts are easier to read than uppercase fonts, but it does depend on the actual font that you're using and the spacing that you use between the letters. The Series E font, lowercase, is actually very well spaced out and very well formed letters for good legibility. But the font that's been adopted in the City of Melbourne is certainly not that easy to read. But maybe people are travelling a bit slower in the City of Melbourne, so they've got a bit more time to read it. Okay, community facility signs. These give directions to community and non-commercial facilities such as schools and churches and football grounds. There's a lot of pressure to put more of these up, but we should avoid sign proliferation, desirably a maximum of 2 facilities signed on the one pole. And there's further guidance in the Victorian Tourist Signing Guidelines, and also I think in the Victorian Supplement. The guidance on tourist and services signs is in part 6 of the Australian Standard, and it talks about tourist information facilities, tourist destinations, and signing for services. And again, that needs to be read in conjunction with the Victorian Tourist Signing Guidelines, which was being updated last time I asked. We should have asked Viseth last week, or 2 days ago. What's happening with that? I'm not quite sure where that's at, but I'm pretty sure it hasn't been re-released. But nevertheless, the Tourist Signing Guidelines provide some pretty good advice about tourist signing. They give directions for tourist attractions. They're on a brown background, and they use mixed case fonts, in other words, lowercase letters with an uppercase first letter. And we mention that because that actually is contrary to the Australian Standard. In Victoria, we're using mixed case, whereas the Australian Standard actually says uppercase. And South Australia, for instance, they didn't want to change, so the Australian Standard hasn't changed. But that is one area where Victoria departs from the Australian Standard. I'm not quite sure what happens in New South Wales. And the so the destination name is in mixed case, but the traffic direction is in uppercase. So the traffic direction might be this exit or turn right or on left. That's in uppercase, but a smaller letter height, whereas the destination is in Series E mixed case, which has probably the best legibility. And these signs can be enhanced with symbols as well. There's probably tourist signs are the ones that provide the greatest controversy for traffic engineers in both the state and local government levels. There's always pressure from tourist operators to have more signs to their particular attraction, but we need to be very careful about that. And the bottom line is that the signs are there for navigational purposes and not for advertising the attraction. Having the sign there is a sort of promotional benefit to the attraction owner, but that's not the reason for the sign. The sign is there so that people can actually find the place, not to advertise the place. Desirably, a maximum of 3 symbols on a sign. The symbols are generally placed above or to the left of the name, and the symbols should reduce the number of words required to be shown. So, for instance, well, let's just go through these. The first one is art gallery, that one's performing arts, that one's specialist foods. This one is walking trails, and I think that those 4 are special for Victoria. I'm not quite sure whether the other states have adopted them, but the wineries is universal across Australia. Lookout Point is also universal across Australia. So, for instance, if you're using the Lookout Point symbol, you don't really need to put the word lookout on there. So we should use the symbols to replace words, not necessarily just to add more things to the sign. Of course, there are many other symbols available. There's ones for heritage, museum, Wales, Aboriginal heritage, cross-country skiing, downhill skiing. So there's quite a few other tourist symbols. And standard ones. That, again, don't invent your own symbols unless they are well tested and approved at the state government level. So the way in which we lay out the signs for an attraction that's on a side road is like this. Again, you have an advanced direction sign around about 200 metres. Doesn't have to be exactly 200 metres. Could be 250 or could be 100 metres if you're in a lower speed zone. And then the intersection direction signs have a chevron end and may or may not include the distance depending on how far it is. If it's like only within a kilometre, you wouldn't bother. And that would cover both directions of travel. Yes, and the other thing about that is that we use turn right 200 metres rather than an arrowhead. And I've never really been 100% sure as to why that is, but it has been so for decades. And I think the reason is that if you used an arrow, it would be a bit unclear about whether you turn at an intersection or you turn into a driveway. So, for instance, if there was a driveway somewhere between this sign and this intersection, how do you know whether the arrow, if there was an arrow there, if the arrow was telling you to turn right at the intersection or telling you to turn right at the driveway? So, whereas the green signs are always telling you where to turn at a road because they're about directions on the road, they can have arrowheads. But the brown signs and the blue signs, the advanced ones, actually tell you to turn right 200 metres rather than an arrowhead. Okay, The extent of signing, and this is probably the most important thing within the Victorian tourist signing guidelines, and I'm pretty sure the same applies in most other states. And the extent of signing should be from no further than the nearest arterial road. And this guideline, which I regard as a fairly strict rule, is very often broken. And I think this is one of the areas where we should clean things up and get rid of the signs that are too far away from the actual destination itself. And as GPS navigation systems are becoming more and more common, it's very easy to operate them on your phone. If you're going to a destination you've never been to before, most people will actually set the destination through their navigation system, and therefore they don't really need these advanced signs. They might need the sign right at the entrance to the place because the GPS might not be quite that accurate, it might not be that easy to see, but signing places from 13 or 24 kilometres away is really completely contrary to the guidance in the Victorian Tourist Signing Guidelines, and pretty similar in the other states. The exceptions to that rule are visitor information centres, which we regard as the highest priority. If tourists are touring around and they want to know where to go, the first place they should go is to the Visitor Information Centre to pick up some brochures and talk to people about what are the good things to do and see in that area. And the other exception are attractions of state or national importance, which in Victoria are determined by the Department of Transport now, and what used to be Tourism Victoria, but has now also been absorbed into some other massive department. But the tourism people within that department and the VicRoads people should decide on which attractions are state or national importance, and they're the only exceptions to this rule. Services signs. So services signs give directions to services or community facilities, and really basically that covers virtually everything that doesn't fit on a green or a brown sign. Services signs have a blue background with white text. Again, the establishment names are in mixed case font rather than uppercase, and it includes airports, accommodation, hospitals, education facilities, sporting facilities, churches, rest areas, a whole lot of things. So here are some of the symbols. Again, maximum 3 symbols on a sign. A whole range of symbols have been developed, which are in the Australian standards and in the various guides. Again, the symbols should be able to reduce the number of words to be shown. So you've got things like fuel, accommodation, caravan parks, restaurants, which by the way is a spoon and fork, not a knife and fork. Not quite sure why, but that's the standard symbol. Rest areas, and this is the standard symbol, whether or not there happens to be a tree there, and airport. And there's a whole lot of other ones there as well for different places. So I think I gave you a bit of a clue to the answer to this question, but Kathy's going to launch a question here about golf courses. There's only a choice of 3 there, so have a guess and put in your answers to this poll question.
Thanks, David. And just a question that came up whilst you were running through that session then. Do we not need to use the Australian standard? You talked about there's the Australian standard and then there's other.
Well, it depends what you are looking for. The Australian standard has got more detail on the layout of sign faces and rules about like the thickness of the border, and the Australian standard 1744 has got your fonts in it. So probably the design of the signs is covered more by the Australian standard, but the where do you put tourist and services signs is covered more by the by the Victorian Tourist Signing Guidelines in
Okay.
Victoria. And I know New South Wales has also got a very comprehensive tourist signing guideline. I'm not quite sure what they're called, but the same sort of thing.
Yeah. Great. All right.
But really, every self-respecting traffic engineer should have a copy of the road rules on their desk and access to the whole suite of Australian standards, because there's always times when you need to look them up.
every self-respecting traffic engineer. Okay.
There we go.
All right. We've just about got everyone with their answers in, so I'll close that one off and share that. Signs to a golf course should be
brown or blue, tourist or services, and they shouldn't be green, because green signs, basically the place that you sign on a green sign is a suburb, town, city, or yeah, that's about it probably. Suburb, town or city. Occasionally it's something else like Melbourne Airport. Golf courses should be blue. It is a little bit of a line ball decision, and it depends a bit on the golf course, whether they're open to the general public or whether they're private golf courses, whether you have to book or not. So you could sort of go either way, but the guidance is that they're sporting locations and therefore they should be blue. And it's better that they're all the same colour. And the advice is that they should all be blue. And I raise that question because quite often they're not. Quite often they're brown instead, because sometimes the golf course operator thinks, oh, you know, we're going to attract more tourists to come to our golf course, so let's make them brown. But no, they should be blue. So the choice of brown and blue is quite often done incorrectly, in my view. Sometimes it's not a big issue, but there is pretty clear guidance within the tourist signing guidelines as to which things should be blue and which things should be brown. Okay, let's move along. So there are other signs which are just purely informational signs, and this is just a very small selection of them. The crossroad name is simply black on white, and it doesn't have any arrows, and that's because this particular sign is reserved for freeways where you're signing the bridge that goes over the freeway or the road that goes under the freeway, purely for the purposes of helping people work out where they are. Like, freeways often look very much the same as you're driving down them. And of course, you've got the direction signs on the freeway, but there's a long distance between the actual exit to a road and when you go under the bridge, the Blackburn Road Bridge that goes over the top. So that's what that's used for. It isn't essential to use it for every bridge, but if you are going to use it, that's the standard design. Then you've got bridge names. So if a bridge actually has a name named after somebody, again, that's simple black on white. Town names can be simply black on white, although there's a whole variety of those that local government put up to welcome people to their particular town or city. There's a whole suite of roadside notices, which are still published with the VicRoads logo on them, despite the fact that it's now the Department of Transport. And there are occasionally other signs for other government departments, such as the EPA and other signs like banning particular vegetable materials and other things. If there's an enforcement component to the sign, then more recently we've been using blue text on a white background. So things like speed cameras in this area and those sorts of things tend to be blue on white. The blue sort of reflecting the police. So there's many information signs as well. Kilometre posts and administrative markers. Kilometre posts are these shaped signs with just a single letter or sometimes two letters indicating the next major town or city and the number of kilometres to them. Again, with navigational systems these days, probably they're less important, but if they're still provided along a road, then we should probably still continue to provide them along a road unless there's a policy decision to take them out. And the markers on guideposts are used for administrative purposes only, so that maintenance teams can see where they are along a road, and you can put in distance references with reference to the administrative markers. So again, if they're used on a road, they should be used consistently and kept up to date so that the depot staff know where they're going, or contractors. Advertising signs. So when you get into the area of tourist signing, also you can't help but look at advertising signage as well, because a lot of places like to advertise, and they like to put up their advertising signs on the roadside where they're going to be seen by a lot of people. And there's quite a bit of legislation that governs all of this. So Section 66 of the Road Management Act gives the road authorities the power to control advertising signs on or over the road reserve, and consent is required from the Coordinating Road Authority. The Coordinating Road Authority is the Department of Transport for all arterial roads and freeways, and it's local government for municipal roads. In deciding whether advertising signs should be allowed or not, there's a regulation that outlines some of the safety aspects that must be considered, but doesn't really give you a black and white answer. And the Victorian planning provisions are also very important because they outline the legal requirements for advertising signs and promotion signs. And it states that an application to display an animated or electronic sign within 60 metres of a freeway or arterial road must be referenced to VicRoads, now the Department of Transport, as the referral authority. So referral authority doesn't necessarily mean, well, it doesn't mean that they've got the final say. It's local government who are the planning decision makers, but local government must refer those signs to Department of Transport as a referral before they make their decision. And hopefully the Department of Transport can have some influence on that decision. These are some of the elements that are regarded as a safety hazard on advertising signs: if they obstruct a driver's line of sight, if they could dazzle or distract drivers due to the size or colouring or being illuminated or reflective or animated or flashing, if it's likely to be mistaken for a traffic control device. So advertising signs saying, stop here, you know, buy your McDonald's or whatever, and they use the word stop in something that looks like a stop sign, that would be unacceptable because it could be mistaken for a traffic control device. So there's some of the considerations in advertising signs. Okay, any questions so far?
Yes, David. Tell us about a no fishing sign. Is it enforceable?
Is it enforceable? Now, there's a good question. I don't really know whether it's enforceable or not, unless there's some sort of bylaw. Very good question. I'm not even sure where I could look that up to find an answer to that question.
It wouldn't be in your copy of the road rules?
No, well, it wouldn't be a road rules issue. Like if you're standing on a footpath,
yes,
there's no rule against that. So if you're standing on a footpath and happen to be fishing, yeah, I'm not quite sure where that would be. So
It's a good question. It stumped you. Well done.
Special prize to whoever asked that question. Okay, let's move along because we've got quite a bit to cover today. So now we're into pavement markings. Okay, so the purpose of lines and pavement markings are to guide vehicles along the road. So that's a very important role for them to play. To inform of movements at intersection, generally through arrows at the intersection on the pavement. Safe crossing locations for pedestrians. They reinforce or invoke road rules where you can or can't go. So again, understanding the road rules in relation to pavement markings is important. Things to keep in mind, lines and markings can be obscured by traffic. So as we have more congestion in our cities and more queuing, it can be more difficult to see the markings on the road. And also the markings are not necessarily easily visible during the wet or in dusty conditions, but particularly in the wet, because we talked in the first session about retroreflectivity of line marking and signs. But in line marking, it's achieved by having a glass bead embedded in the white paint. So a whole lot of white beads which will reflect the light back the way they come. But the refractive index of glass is different if it's covered by water. So therefore you can't actually see the lines nearly as well in the wet as you can in the dry. Also because of tyre wear, of course, the line marking on the road can wear out pretty quickly. Also, you need to be careful about skid resistance. The glass beads in the paint actually make the white paint more slippery, but to compensate for that, the line marking manufacturers put quartz into it, which is like little grains, almost grains of sand, and that increases the skid resistance. So hopefully the sand counteracts the glass beads, and overall the skid resistance should be pretty reasonable. And the objective of skid resistance is to try to make the skid resistance properties of the line marking equivalent to the skid resistance properties of the surrounding pavement, so that there's no difference. But that's never going to be perfect, and therefore the line marking can be a little bit of a hazard, particularly to motorcyclists. If they're trying to brake and then their tyres go over a bit of white paint, which has got a different skid resistance property to the surrounding pavement, then they might lose control. It's the risk, I think, is not quite as bad as a lot of motorcyclists claim it is, but it's something to be careful about. Clearly, if you've got adjacent signs and pavement markings, they must not contradict each other. They must work together to provide the same message to the road users. So right in session 1, we talked about the different types of lines and pavement markings, and they are covered within the Australian standards and the guidelines in these categories. Longitudinal lines, those that are along the road, transverse lines that are across the road, other markings which consist of painted islands, arrows, and symbols and words. And then also you've got the RRPMs, which are there to augment the line marking. So, firstly, dividing lines. The dividing lines separate opposing traffic on undivided two-way roads. So sometimes they've been called separation lines because they separate the two directions of travel. Sometimes they're called centre lines because they're generally in the centre of the road, but of course they don't have to be in the centre of the road. You might have one lane in this direction and two lanes in the other direction. So the road rules definition is a dividing line, and all the guidelines are trying to pick up that terminology as well. So dividing lines are a standard pattern of a 3-metre line with a 9-metre gap, and generally 100 millimetres wide. But if you want to put a bit more paint on the road, make the dividing line a bit more obvious for some reason, a bit more conspicuous to drivers, then you should stick with the 12-metre pattern, but make the line 9 metres long and the gap 3 metres. So that's for special purposes. And if you have a simple broken dividing line, then all turns, U-turns, overtaking, everything is allowed across that line, which I'm sure you all know. There are a couple of special purpose dividing lines. The 6 metre line with a 6 metre gap is reserved for a very unusual situation where you've got a reversible lane. So a lane is one direction during the morning peak, and then sometime during the day it changes to be in the other direction for the PM peak. And then the lane on one side is a lane line at some times of the day, and it's a dividing line at other times of the day. So to sort of go halfway between those two options, we've decided on a 6 metre line and a 6 metre gap. Now, this line causes a lot of confusion and isn't very well explained in some of the documentation. This is a 30-metre line. If you add up all those dimensions, it's a 30-metre line approaching a give way or stop line. And I think I might have it in the next slide. Yes, I do. So this is something I've mocked up because it isn't really explained very well in the guidelines. Generally speaking, if you have a stop line or a give way line here, then in order to provide a bit more conspicuity of that as the driver is approaching on this side road, you provide a 30-metre line. That has been the practice in Victoria for a long time. It isn't covered by every state in the same way, but the point about that is that a continuous dividing line means that you're not allowed to park adjacent to that dividing line unless you leave a 3-metre gap, 3 metres clear between the edge of the parked car and the line. In other words, so that someone can pass by and not drive over the line. If, however, you want to allow parking, then you've got to make that line so it's not a continuous line. And the reason the way to do that is to put 2 brakes in it. So, you know, I know this is a subtlety, but just to make sure that we're compatible with the road rules, if you want to allow parking adjacent to one of these 30-metre lines, and there isn't sufficient space to allow a parked car and another 3 metres of space, then put 2 brakes in it. So that's the idea of that particular option for a dividing line in the guidelines. And quite relevant to local government people when you've got narrow side roads, of which there must be many. Okay, now dividing lines also can be, as well as being broken dividing lines, they can be single barrier lines which prohibit overtaking. They can be one-way barrier lines with a continuous line on one side and a 3-metre line and 9-metre gap on the other side, which allows overtaking in one direction but not the other. And it can be a double barrier line which says no turns and no overtaking allowed in either direction. So you're probably mostly familiar with that from driving around and from whenever you got your learner's permit. So these are the ways in which the road rules apply. What isn't as well known is how this relates to U-turns and maybe also the single line. So the single line allows people to cross the line to enter or leave the road. So you can do a right turn across it and you can cross the line to come into the road, but you can't overtake. So that's the difference between a single continuous line and a double line. And the broken line allows you to enter or leave the road across the broken line side and also U-turn. And in this case, also you can cross it to enter or leave the road, but you can't do a U-turn. So understanding all of that is very important for applying these lines in practice. So if you have a double line on a road and you've got the occasional driveway, then if you want to allow the people coming out of the driveway to cross the line, then you have to leave a break in the line. Whereas if it's a single continuous line, which also prohibits overtaking, you don't need to provide breaks in the line because the line allows you to cross the line to enter or leave the road. So if you want to prevent overtaking, do you simply use a continuous line or a double line? And there is some guidance on that. And generally speaking, we say stick with the double line because that's what drivers have known for a long time. Most drivers are used to that. So where preventing overtaking is the serious issue, then use a double line wherever possible. However, if it's a very curvy road with a lot of driveways, and therefore you would end up with a lot of breaks in this road, then maybe a single line would be okay. So there's a few sort of exceptions. Okay. All right. Then we come to lane lines. So a lane line divides traffic travelling in the same direction, and it's usually just a broken line pattern. And a lane line can be continuous where it's intended to prohibit lane changing. Oh, we've got a little animation there. That's pretty. So the standard pattern for a lane line is a 3 metre line with a 9 metre gap. So there's actually no difference between the standard lane line and the standard dividing line. They're both 3 metre lines with a 9 metre gap. And that might cause some confusion in some places. So if it's a continuous line, then it prevents lane changing. And for instance, we provide the 30 metre continuous line on the approach to a stop line or a give way line that we discussed before, and also on the approach to traffic signals. Then we have continuity lines. So these are lines which are a 1 metre long with a 3 metre gap. They indicate the edges of a roadway where traffic can cross when turning at an intersection. So at merge points where we're actually expecting the traffic to change lanes. It marks the entrance points at unsignalised intersections and median openings. All right, okay, well, we don't really have a good name for that line. This is the line which is a continuation of the give way line or stop line, but for traffic travelling in the opposite direction. It was formerly known as the StatCon lines, but we don't actually have a good name for this particular line. But we'll see that in these. So this is the line I'm talking about here. That's a stop line there. What's this line? Well, it's sort of a continuity line. If you think about it from the point of view of the driver travelling along the main road here, it's a continuity line. It's providing a continuity of the edge line along the road, and particularly important if it's a very wide flare on that part of the roadway. So these are all continuity lines where you enter a right turn lane or where you enter a left turn lane. This is a continuity line here, sort of providing continuity of the median, the edge of the median. So all of those are important, but you expect drivers to cross them. So they're not continuous lines, they are continuity lines. Okay. The line separating a right turn lane from a through lane causes some degree of problem. the continuous part of the line means changing lanes is not permitted. But if you have a very long lane here, there's really no reason why people can't enter that lane, several tens of metres after the lane has started, particularly if there isn't much traffic around or you can't read the road signs well enough in advance, make a late decision as to whether to turn or not. So we don't want the continuous line to be too long. On the other hand, we don't want the continuity line, this broken one here, to be too long either. So if it is very long, then we actually have three types of line: a continuity line, then a 9-3 pattern, and then the continuous line. So this table sort of explains all of that. It's a little bit complicated, but not too difficult to follow if you have that situation. And the other thing about that is providing the arrows within a lane. It used to be that the arrows were placed, I think, 25 metres apart, and now the guidance is put the first one 6 metres from the stop line, put the last one, or the first one in the direction of travel, whichever way you want to look at it, as far upstream as you can within the lane, and then space out the others intermediately. So, and the reason for that is you want the first arrow that the driver is likely to see as far upstream as you can get it, in order to give drivers a good chance to actually see what the lane designation is for that lane. Okay, now we're up to edge lines. So edge lines indicate the edge of the roadway. They're not provided on every road. The road needs to be wide enough to incorporate an edge line. Normally it's 100 millimetres wide. For freeways it's 150 millimetres wide, and also M routes and A routes. They can also be yellow, which is used to ban parking. And the last one is, again, a very unusual special application. We use yellow edge lines in snow areas because white lines are white, snow is white. It's not that easy to see the white line in snow, so it's actually better to use a yellow line in snow. But if you use a continuous yellow edge line in a snow area, then that will ban parking. So if you want to provide the yellow line in a snow area, but you don't want to ban the parking, then again, just make it a broken line by putting the occasional gap in it. And we're suggesting a 9 metre line with a 1 metre gap. Very unusual. Profiled lines. So profiled lines, sometimes called audio tactile lines, the ones with the bumps on them. And they have been shown through quite a few studies to be very good at preventing off-road crashes. They're regularly spaced ribs that are added to the line in thermoplastic, and they provide an audible warning and a little bit of vibration when the vehicle runs over the lines. And for roads like the Western Highway, which is where some of the studies have been done, which in the outer western part of Victoria is a pretty boring straight road, and in a location where fatigue is likely to be a problem for long distance drivers, they have been proven to be quite valuable in reducing the amount of off-road crashes. Now, profiled lines, as well as being possible on the edge line, they're also possible on the dividing line, if it's a continuous dividing line or a double line dividing line. If it's a broken dividing line, then you can make like white ribs on the white lines and black ribs on the bits of pavement between the stripes, or even indentations rather than ribs going up. So there's various versions of that, and I think there's a few design notes that VicRoads puts out about that. Someone's asked, what are A, B, C and M routes? These are the designations of the roads that are used on the direction signs. So the direction signs show M for motorways, and then you have A, B and C routes. Viseth talked a bit about that in his session. And so every road in Victoria has a designation of being either A, B, C or M. And I'm pretty sure the same is the case in New South Wales and South Australia, but hasn't quite got to Western Australia yet. I'm not quite sure how fully that the designations are in Queensland. So that guideline, what was that guideline where that came up? Oh, here, the width of this line. I'm pretty sure that this is a Victorian guideline, which might not necessarily apply in other states.
David, sorry, just quickly, could you just run, what are A, B, C and M routes? What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I think I've just described that, the different designations of the routes which are on plans within the traffic engineering manual, but also just from the road signs. You can tell what the route is from the road signs in Victoria. But I think New South Wales don't sign any of their C routes. I think New South Wales only sign A and B routes and not the C routes. So that can be tricky. But as I say, I think that guideline is for Victorian roads. How that applies in other states, I'm not quite sure. Okay, I think I've talked about profile. Oh, there's just one other thing I want to say about profiled lines. Profiled lines or audio tactile lines are very valuable on long, straight, boring roads where fatigue is likely to be a problem, but they're sometimes used also on curvy roads, on winding roads, where I really don't think they are necessarily providing the same benefit. You have to be fairly alert anyway to drive on a curvy road. It's unlikely that you're going to be suffering that much from fatigue. So I question the use of this sort of treatment on windy roads. Besides which, it's sort of a benefit cost question. It costs a lot more to put down profiled lines, and it's difficult to maintain them because no one yet has invented a machine that can go along and put down blobs of thermoplastic exactly on the top of the previous blob of thermoplastic in order to build them up again if they wear down. Basically, you've got to wait until you resurface the road to put down the profiled lines again, and they're much more likely to be worn down on a curvy road because of gravel and because of people driving over them to cut corners, etc. So that's my little take on profiled lines. Now we're into transverse lines. So the lines that go across the road, giveaway lines are a classic. The holding line at roundabouts is the same. At the roundabout, they are 400 millimeters wide, and at giveaway signs, they're 300 millimeters wide. And then the continuity line on the other side is the same pattern, but just a bit thinner. And all of that is covered in the Australian standards. However, the Australian standards do give a range of widths of these lines, and therefore you need to look at your state supplements to get the guidance on what applies in your state. The giveaway line or stop line should be set back from the lane. Well, this is probably a dividing line on a two-lane, two-way road by at least 6 meters if there's no curb. So if it's a road with an edge of seal or a shoulder, then you want to provide that extra space just in case someone is trying to turn right here, that the other driver can get past them without crashing into someone who's waiting at the giveaway line. The holding line at a roundabout should be curved. Basically, it should be circumferential to the central island. Stop lines. Again, the width of stop lines varies from state to state, but in Victoria it should be 300 millimetres wide for a stop sign at a stop intersection, 450 at a children's crossing, and 600 wide at a signalised intersection. Chevron markings and diagonal markings, very important that we get these correct. When looking in plan view at the intersection, you need to check whether the traffic is going both sides of the painted island or in each direction. And the way I think about this is that this is the white line, this is the white chevron that's painted on the road. If you built that up in concrete, then if you hit it, you're directed back into the lane you're travelling in. That's sort of the way I think about how you make sure that the chevrons are facing the right way. And if they're stripes because traffic is going in two directions past the island, then again, if you hit this, you'll be directed back in your lane. And if you're going in the other direction and if you hit this, you're directed back into your lane. You might have a different way of thinking about it, but that's the way I sort of think about making sure that the chevrons or stripes are done correctly. The chevron spacing or the stripe bar spacing increases as the speed limit increases, and there's a lot of guidance within the Australian standard for that. Messages on pavements. So words, numerals and symbols can be used on the pavement to guide and warn and regulate the drivers. So bus lane is an example, and that is regulatory. Rail X is another example, but that's not regulatory. That's just warning you that there's a rail crossing coming up. And if the message is in two lines of text, then the question is, do you read it from top to bottom or do you read it from bottom to top? And personally, I'm a top to bottom person, but the Australian standard came up with a bit of a compromise here, that you read it top to bottom if the speed is less than or equal to 80 kilometres an hour, but if it's more than 80 kilometres an hour, in other words, a speed limit of 90 or 100 or above, then you read it bottom to top. So then a bus lane is not a good example because you're not likely to have a bus lane in a 100 kilometre an hour zone, but you would put the word bus first and then you get to the word lane second. That's the way it's suggested you put the words out. So Rail X is probably a better example. If you're on a 100 kilometre an hour road, you have the word rail first and then the X afterwards. Whereas if it's 80 kilometres or less, then you have rail on the top and then X underneath it. Okay, pavement arrows. These are important at all types of intersections, particularly signalised intersections and roundabouts and merge areas. If you've only got one lane on the approach, then it really doesn't matter because you can turn left, go through, or turn right. But if you've got multiple lanes, then including pavement arrows is good practice. The practice is not the same in all states. For instance, in South Australia, in this example, they wouldn't put in these through arrows. They just leave them out because if there's no marking, then it just means you can go through. But in Victoria, we put them in. The turn arrows should be put in if it's a turn bay as far upstream in that exclusive turn lane as you can get them. If it's a continuous lane, then a reasonable distance upstream, preferably beyond where the maximum queue is likely to be. So that's sort of the guidance on how far upstream you would put the arrows. But the through arrows, we generally only put one close to the stop line. And they're legally enforceable. So the arrow means the driver must depart the intersection in the direction that the arrow is showing. However, a right turn arrow also allows you to do a U-turn, unless there's a no U-turn sign. Keep clear markings. These are regulatory, but actually in most cases they don't need to be regulatory because there's a road rule anyway that says drivers must not stop in within an intersection. So they can, however, be used just on straight stretches of road to indicate keep clear. That might be, for instance, opposite the driveway to an ambulance station or a fire station, for instance, which is a driveway. It's not a road, so therefore it's not an intersection. And therefore the requirement to keep it clear is not in the road rules. So you can put in a keep clear marking to make it a road rule. But at the general intersection, keep clear markings have been overused. And if we put in a keep clear marking everywhere where a member of the public had requested one, we would probably have keep clears through, 80% of the intersections in Melbourne already. So the guidance on the use of keep clear is fairly strict on trying to prevent the blockages of entrances for the people turning into the side road. So most people think about these as helpful for the people getting out of the side road, but actually drivers shouldn't be blocking the path of the vehicles trying to get out of the side road anyway. And they shouldn't be blocking the path for the vehicles trying to get into the side road either, but that is a much more serious problem, particularly for a case like this, where the right turner propped to turn right into this side road can create a queue which banks back through this intersection, which is really very nasty. So in order to try to overcome the risk of that happening, then that's a good reason for putting in the keep clear marking. But for the drivers that are having difficulty turning left or turning right out of the side road, that's not a good reason for putting in the keep clear marking. We hope that the drivers here will keep it clear under the road rules anyway and give those drivers a chance to get out. So use keep clear markings judiciously. Okay, we're up to questions again, Kathy. Any other questions coming up?
No, not at this stage, David. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to jot them into the chat as we go, or the Q&A.
Okay, that's good. So we're travelling well, so we can probably fit in some questions if people have got any. In the meantime, I will continue on and talk about guideposts and RRPMs. So guideposts are used to mark the edge of the road formation and are very important in rural areas. They indicate the alignment of the road ahead, especially at curves, and improves delineation at night through the use of the reflectors that are put onto the guideposts. And those reflectors are actually called delineators. So they're there to help to delineate the path of the drivers, particularly on curves, but even on straights, they're used as well. So on a straight road in a rural area, which might only have a limited pavement width, so it isn't justified to put in an edge line, then it's the guideposts and delineators on them that help the driver to recognise that where the road goes, which hopefully is still straight, but occasionally it might have a few curves in it. So I sort of regard guideposts as the first device that you should be using in order to help delineation of the driver's path. So guideposts are installed on all rural MAB and C routes, and we talked about MAB and C routes before. The guidance might be slightly different in other states that haven't fully adopted the MABC designations for their roads. On other rural type roads where post delineation is considered necessary and the posts are 1 metre high, they should not be a hazard if struck, so the actual construction of the posts needs to be carefully tested to make sure that they don't fly out of the ground if they're struck, and particularly if they have a pointed end, which helps you put them into the ground, you don't want them to turn into spears if they're struck by a vehicle. There's quite a few varieties of guideposts these days that just simply break away if hit, and there's other ones which are metal and bend over and then spring back up, hopefully, when they're hit. But they're the ones that need to be carefully checked. So I'm guessing that each of the state road authorities will have a set of pre-approved guidepost designs from which you can choose. And the spacing of the guideposts is closer on curves. So the delineators on the guideposts, they're the reflectors on the guideposts, and they're made out of retroreflective material. And I think they're shown as circular on this little diagram, but more commonly these days they're a strip, a rectangular strip of sign sheeting material that's put onto the guidepost. But it's important we get the colours correct. They should be red on the left-hand side of the road and white on the right-hand side of a two-way road and yellow on the right-hand side of a one-way roadway. So this is your roadway, and if it's a two-way road, these ones are white. If it's a one-way roadway, then the ones on the right-hand side are yellow. And we'll talk about the RRPMs in a few slides' time. So RRPMs are used to augment the line marking. So I'm not sure there are any cases really where we use RRPMs without the white lines. Virtually always they're there to reinforce the white lines. And as I said before, white lines tend to lose their reflectivity in wet conditions, whereas the RRPMs are better in wet conditions because firstly the front surface is on more of an angle, so the water is going to drain off it a bit quicker than it will drain off the white lines. And it's also angled a bit more towards the driver's eyes. So the RRPMs actually perform better in the wet than the lines do. So that's one good reason for using RRPMs to reinforce the lines. Also, the RRPMs provide a bit of an audible warning to drivers who are straying over the lines, but they're spaced a fair way apart, so that's not a huge advantage, just a little bit of a side benefit. The sort of standard location for RRPMs is in the middle of every second gap. So on a lane line or a dividing line, which has got a 3-9 pattern, then it's midway on within the 9-metre gap along the line. So it's every 24 metres along the road. On continuous lines, however, the spacing is generally as close as 6 metres. And this is the way they'd be laid out on a one-way dividing line or a double dividing line. And because these are in the middle of the road, they are yellow. The edge, if you're using RRPMs to reinforce the edge line, then the edge line, they should be red, obviously facing the direction of travel, and on straights, they would be 24 metres apart. The spacing depends on the road and speed environment, and they can also be used around splitter islands. So this is the same diagram as before, and the colour of the RRPMs reflects the same colour as the delineators on the guideposts. Red on the left and yellow in the middle of the road if it's a two-way road, but white if it's a lane line. So if you've got two lanes in the same direction, then the RRPMs on the lane line are white, and the RRPMs on the right-hand side of a one-way carriageway are yellow to reflect the same colour as the delineator. So the idea, and by the way, the RRPMs on the right-hand side here are blank facing this direction of travel, but they would be red facing the opposite direction of travel. Now, the reason for all of those standards is to try to create a difference, even though it's a fairly subtle difference, between the two-lane two-way road and the two-lane one-way carriageway. Because if you turn into a two-lane one-way carriageway, because this is part of a divided road, but you can't see the other carriageway going the other direction, you might not be sure what sort of roadway you've entered. And if it's a serious problem, you can actually put white arrows in the lanes. But often these are just, driveways and small places that people might turn into the road. You can't be putting arrows everywhere. So this is one of the ways in which we try to create a subtle difference between those two cases, whether you use white or yellow on the right-hand side. And also that was a change made 10 or 15 years ago in order to also bring all the states into the same set of standards. Cool. We also use green RRPMs in a very specific location leading up to what we call a diverge off onto an off-ramp in rural areas where there's this step-out marking. So instead of just being a gradual diverge, in order to try to prevent people who might be a bit sleepy accidentally taking the exit when they should be going straight through, we use this step out marking and we use the green RRPMs leading up to it. Also, just another sort of subtle difference to try to prevent that happening. Okay, and then blue RRPMs are not used in conjunction with line marking and are not a road related issue. They're used purely and only to mark water points for the fire services. And they're not the responsibility of the road authorities, they're the responsibility of the water or fire authorities, somebody else. But the reason we talk about that is just so that someone doesn't have a bright idea of introducing a new colour into the colour scheme of RRPMs and say, oh, we don't use blue for anything, let's use blue for this. No, you can't use blue because blue is reserved for water points. If you want a new colour, that'll have to be pink or purple or something different. Okay, so they're the green ones on the left and the blue ones on the right. Now, there are other raised pavement markers which are non-reflective, sometimes called ceramics, although I think these days they're probably more likely to be made out of plastic rather than ceramic. And they're non-reflective, they're just round discs to mark intersection points on the road where the lane line or the projection of the lane lines would intersect. And for very wide intersections, I think they're a very good idea. And for wide intersections where there's where the approach lane and the departure lane don't quite line up, as for instance, this lane, if you continue that lane straight ahead, you'd end up over here somewhere. It's very useful to help delineate the path of the drivers through the intersection. They're difficult to put in. You sort of got to close the intersection, or at least a corner of the intersection to do it. And they are probably some of the least easy to maintain because they often get driven over. But still, for these situations, I think they're a very worthwhile improvement to the delineation of the path through the intersection. This is covered in the Australian Standard and also the VicRoads Supplement, and I can't remember which one, but one of the diagrams actually shows the pattern of non-reflective markers going through the middle of the intersection as well. However, and one of them says, this comes from one of the other documents, I'm not quite sure which one, but I strongly recommend that you don't put the markers in the middle of the intersection as defined by this diamond shape of the turn lines, because that's where the right turners are going to go, and the right turners are going to get a bit confused if you have markers sort of right in the middle of their path. And also, that's the most difficult part of the intersection to actually install the raised pavement markers. So I would recommend not putting them in this central diamond-shaped bit, despite what it says in one of the guidelines. So that's another device that can be very useful to help delineation through intersections, particularly wide intersections. Okay, so that brings us to the end, and I think we've got some questions, have we, Kathy?
Yes, we do. Why don't we see RRPMs used more on rural, I can never say that word, rural road networks, especially when lighting infrastructure is lacking?
Lack of money. That's about the only reason I can think of. I think they're very valuable. Well, they're more valuable where you don't have street lighting. So they're useful in urban areas, but they're more useful in rural areas. But of course, rural areas have got much longer lengths of road, so it's more expensive to put them in and to maintain them. The general guidance in Victoria is C roads probably don't have RRPMs unless there's a particular problem. And that's simply to save money, I would say. But if you've got particular delineation issues, then I think putting the RRPMs in is a very good idea. So for rural roads, my first line of defence is guideposts. My second line of defence is an edge line, if you can fit it in. And my third line of defence would be to put in RRPMs. Actually, probably my first line of defence is to put in the dividing line, if there isn't one already. So dividing line first, then then guidepost second, then edge lines third, and then RRPMs to reinforce the dividing line and RRPMs to reinforce the edge line would be my last choice. So that's my general approach to delineation in rural areas. And then beyond that, of course, you've got your CAMs, you've got your chevron alignment markers, particularly on curves, or if they're curves that don't meet the Australian standard requirements, then even just black and white hazard markers would be my last line of defence. And I sort of lay all that out like that because sometimes traffic engineers get a bit carried away with their treatments and say, oh, this is a potentially dangerous bit of road. Let's put in CAMs along the whole road. Like, that's overkill and over treating that road when there might be many other roads in the network that don't even have RRPMs in the first place.
Okay, so, thank you, David.
Yep.
Do you have a location for the last slide? So maybe just...
This one?
Yeah.
Well, that's a fictitious intersection.
Okay.
But there are many signalised intersections around Australia where the lane lines don't quite line up. And if it's only over a narrow distance, you can probably work it out. But if it's over a wider intersection, then the non-reflective RPMs are a very good idea.
Great. There's another question here about, can you tell us the length of the line marking at the tail end of a traffic island? Is it the same as the 30-metre line marking leading up to a give-way stop sign?
On the tail, well, the tail end of a traffic island, is that the approach direction for the other direction of travel? If it's in the middle of the road, it is. So that sort of answers that question. But if it's an island where traffic is going both sides of the island,
we've got a
in the one
follow-up.
direction.
It suggesting it is the approach. Yes.
Then I think the answer is there's no particular guidance. Whatever you think's a fair thing. Yeah. So there's road design guidance on tapers. So if you have an island and then basically it tapers back to a single line, then it's the dimension of that taper that is important. And that would probably determine how long the lines are until you get back to the lane line at the other end.
Right. Okay, good. We don't have any other questions at the moment. So if you do have any burning questions, now is the time to ask, because there's 2 minutes to go. But of course you can email any further burning questions or anything that might come up through as well.
Yes, I'd be happy to answer any other questions people have got.
Thank you, David. We do have a quiz, module 3 and 4 quiz, which is live in Schoology, and there was one for module 1 and 2 as well. So do jump in and do those, and then once you've done those and you've completed all your exercises and everything, we'll send you your certificate. You'll get an electronic version via email, possibly next week, possibly early January, and then we'll send you a hard copy definitely early January when things kick on again. Do you have a picture of the non-reflective one? Another question's come through.
A picture of the actual device? No, I don't have a picture, but it's just like a pancake. It's a circular disc that you just stick onto the road.
Okay. All right, I'll use a pancake. It sounds like there's a business opportunity for your audio tactile line marking maintenance you talked about earlier, because there's no way to just do the odd 1 or 2. So if anyone's thinking about starting something up, that could be something. Thank you very much, David. Appreciate you putting together this program and exercises and everything, and sharing your wonderful knowledge with everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your participation throughout the program, and especially doing it at this time of year, which I know is very busy for everyone. Yeah, any further questions or comments or anything, please send them through. Otherwise, you will hear from me soon enough with your certificate. And as well, we'll ask for some feedback on the program to help us improve it for next time. So I think that's about it. Merry Christmas and happy festive season, and see you all next time.
Thank you, Kathy. See you all.